Well, thank you, and I'll start out with that other university greeting. Howdy. How many of you are engineers? Hydrologists? Lawyers? Economists? Oh, we do have a few. Wonderful. All right. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Ronald Lacewell, who has worked in the state for many, many years, and I'm not calling him old, he's just very well experienced. The photo that you're looking at is actually the Rio Grande and towards El Paso, and that's Franklin Mountain in El Paso. Well, just the very beginning here, economics is not a number of things that most people think of it as. Not the stock market, not the bond market. You certainly use economics for these things. And not just about profits or business. It's really the interdisciplinary or interaction between all these things. It's the intersection of law, policy, physics, hydrology, climate. And so you need to look at all those things when you're looking at the economic value of water. It's used for many purposes: forecasting demand, estimating supply, looking at the value of resources that aren't priced or don't have markets for them, such as ecosystem services, looking at alternative laws and policies and the impacts of those laws and policies, looking at the benefits of improving water quality or deterioration of water quality. And are the projects that are proposed, the 562, for example, beneficial? Do the benefits exceed the costs? It's also used to look at damages from drought, look at the economic impacts of climate change, risk assessments, and understanding the impacts, as I mentioned, of allocation and distribution. So why water resource economics? First, we need to recognize that we don't manage water for water's sake. We manage it for the values, the services it provides. And that's where economics comes in. The world has recognized that water has value. And this was done in the UN conference in 1992 and said, I think, more directly by Robert Young, that water has an economic value in all of its uses. And we need to recognize those values. It's also interdisciplinary and cuts across many interdependencies. So food, energy, and there's the energy-water nexus that's been talked about a lot, health, transportation, and other services. Well, some people say you just need to price water at its value. Well, what is water worth? And who determines that? And in what use? And is this during drought or flood conditions? Do we have one price, or does the price change from day to day? Who sets the price? Well, markets won't always solve these issues. They can help, but they don't always solve those issues. And it's also important to recognize that the price of water almost is always lower than the value of water. And there are a lot of reasons for this. There are economic incentives or missing incentives, laws that say utilities can only charge for the cost of water, not the value. Water right ownership issues. If I own the water, why should I raise the price? Lots of other reasons. So these issues are not just, local, regional, state, they're international. And an example of this is how we treat water. Because many of the products, and particularly agricultural products, have water embedded in them. How much water did it take? This was a great example in the Panhandle with T. Boone Pickens. People were very upset. You're going to export our water? Well, what are they doing? They're pumping the Ogallala Aquifer, growing crops, and exporting those crops. That's water. And these are the flows, and you can see how much leaves the U.S. in terms of water in these various products. Well, it's also very contentious and lots of vulnerabilities, whether it's drought, political conflicts, declining aquifers. This is just an indication of how widespread these issues are. In the U.S., this is a map put together by the World Resources, and you can see Plainview, Texas. These are non-recurring sources of water. And that declining graph that was showed in terms of the water supplies was in large part, we will have fewer or less groundwater available in the next 10, 20, 50 years. The USBR-Reclamation also took a look at areas of the world that were in water crisis. And this was in 2003, and these have actually expanded tremendously. Anyone want to go boating? This is Elephant Butte Reservoir, the Rio Grande project. This is when it was 20% full in 2003. Last August, it was 3% full, 97% empty. And this is the mighty Rio Grande. Last year, it ran for a total of 6 weeks. That was it. So the population of El Paso and Juarez, approximately 2.5 million combined, relies on this as their only source of surface water. And we know the impacts across Texas of the drought. It was mentioned the wonderful line down essentially I-35. Well, here we can really see it. If you don't have water in all of West Texas, what are you going to do? So we're turning to other sources, largely groundwater, and pumping it. This is a well in far West Texas. Well, for the Texas Water Development Board, we looked at what conservation measures could be applied in agriculture in far West Texas. Out of 20 possible major conservation programs, only 3 were left and found to be feasible. And all of those were far above what farmers can afford to pay. So if you look on the far right, and I know the print's kind of small, but up here, in drought conditions, it would cost this much per acre foot. In full water supply conditions, and this is for lining or canals or putting in pipelines, they could move to a different type of scheduling, and that's, again, very difficult. This is possible, or tailwater reuse. So let's take a look at here. This is the marginal value of water in agriculture in a number of states. And it's hard to read, but you know, there are some very high ones, very rare. These are greenhouse crops. But the typical value in most of the West is in the $25 to even $100 is on the high end. Now, I showed you the conservation practices. They would cost far more than that. Farmers can't afford it. We looked at the impacts of Mexico not delivering water into the Rio Grande or from their Rio Conchos on the lower valley. Millions and millions of dollars lost over each 5-year treaty cycle. $21 billion over the last roughly 13 years lost in agriculture. That's right at the farm, not the benefit of the product after that. Then we have our municipal use. And no, this is not Texas. This is the Sinclair refinery in Rawlins, Wyoming. But energy is one of the biggest consumers of water, both producing energy and heating water, transporting water. So here we have almost 25%, and this is within the last month, of our municipal water providers in drought contingency plans. That's currently. That's not even looking ahead. Well, what other values are there? We can put a price on Mother Nature. It's tough, not everyone believes it, but you can. And for wildlife or recreation, there are lots of uses. But we also have to look to the future. And this is one of the forecasts from the climate panel. And you can see on the Rio Grande, it's predicted to have 10 to 20% decrease over the next 30 to 50 years. And then we have population growth. This is where our farm, or right across from our farming research center in El Paso. Now it's houses. Well, I'm going to go through many of these quickly here because you've seen them. The population growth that's projected, the water demand projections, and agriculture again is going to decline because the Panhandle doesn't have another source of water and the farmers can't afford to import it. But this is consistent across the U.S. Over the last 30 to 40 years, water use, water withdrawals, has actually leveled off, even though our population and economy have kept growing. In Texas, we're looking at the decrease in water supplies, the cost of the 562 drought projects. The real question is economic. Do the economic benefits of these 562 projects exceed their cost? I think when it comes down to a vote, we're going to see they probably don't in many cases. These supplies are also going to be surplus in non-drought years. So they're just sitting there idle. I mean, you could say, well, we have a reservoir or more groundwater, but they're going to be sitting there. And you can look at the increasing cost of the various projects. And these are the unit costs as you move from conservation to desalination to new reservoirs, and you can see they keep increasing. One of the most important things in the state water plan is based on gallons per capita per day for the municipal demand. Well, how do we compare? El Paso has done very well in its water savings. The national average is 160 gallons per person per day. Look at Dallas, and they need new reservoirs? Sorry. Do they want to spend that much on reservoirs? Conservation's a lot cheaper. Here's another example from El Paso, and you can see about 40 years ago, we were at over 200 gallons per person per day. But conservation efforts were very effective, and these efforts were economic, prices and incentives, regulations through codes and standards, and education. And one example of education is something that we put out with the USBR-Reclamation, and that's called Drought Watch on the Rio Grande. And this has been very effective in getting both the public and elected officials to understand it's not just a matter if you can turn your tap water on, the water comes out. We need to look at our reservoirs, and they need to be aware of why conservation is so important. This is a study of over 15 years of data of 7 major cities in the west and southwest, LA, San Diego, Denver, Albuquerque. And this example is a demand curve, and I won't get into too much detail, but there are 2 things I'd like to show you. They raised their price in real terms over 10 years, doubled the price, and that got a little bit of reduction. They also had education and other programs. That got as much of a reduction as doubling the price. So there are other methods that can be used. Large costs of not implementing the plans are projected. The largest inland desalination plant in the world in El Paso was constructed and started operating about 6 years ago, Ed, I think. But we, again, need to look at the economics of this. And this is looking at some data from the previous state water plan of the cost of water. On the far left is groundwater at about 50 cents per gallon. Then you have surface water, takes more treatment, desalination, reclaimed water use, and that's higher in part because you might need a separate distribution system. And then finally, importing water from other areas. Well, we have many other costs, and it was pointed out by both Carlos and Liz earlier, but the real question is, again, economic. Are people able to pay these higher costs, and are they willing to pay these higher costs? Because out of that, $231 billion projected over the next 50 years, we've set aside a $2 billion revolving fund. It's a loan fund. So all of these costs would need to be paid by the taxpayer or the water consumer. Well, just a couple of examples of some of the water research that's gone on in economics. Looking at policy changes on the Rio Grande, we could reduce drought impact costs by 30%. IBWC levies save people from damages in a single event $500 million. I mentioned the conservation strategies. We've also looked at water quality impacts. In our region, $10 million per year in impacts from salinity. We could reduce that by half if we could reduce the salinity by 200 milligrams per liter. Lining 10 miles of canals could provide water for 8,000 homes. We've also are working with Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona on the transboundary aquifers, because we really don't know what's underneath the ground, how much is being used, and what that quality and changes over time are. It's a map that goes blank when you look at the other side of the border. Water use in hydraulic fracturing, $115,000 per acre foot is what the fracturing companies could afford to pay. Look at that value compared to farmers. Well, this is the last slide. There are many opportunities in economics. Assessing user willingness and ability to pay, new technologies in both urban and ag, and looking at those values, the application of integrated water resource management. You can't do any of this in isolation. You need to work with the stakeholders and all of the disciplines. And looking at policy and institutional analysis. That's self-promotion there. I'm going to end with West Texas is right next to Roswell, and these are the aliens that are going to come and take our water. So thank you.
Okay, now I just need to figure out how to get my presentation up there.
She does it up there.
She's working on it. Okay, super. Thanks for that. That was a great introduction to economics. Yeah, it's up now. I'm Sheila Olmstead. I'm a professor here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a relative newcomer to Texas, so my focus is going to be naturally less on Texas-specific issues in comparison to Ari and Keith. But what I'm hoping to talk about a little bit is the sort of three major contributions that I think that economics has to make to discussions about water management, like what we're having here today. And then give you some specific examples about how those concepts can and have been useful. The first is water pricing. Okay, so we talk a lot about that. You hear this sort of the most common thing that economists start talking about when they start talking about water resources is the differences in prices across sectors, differences in prices across space, and so on. But the basic idea here is to say that users of water, both all municipal, industrial, agricultural users, should cover the full opportunity cost of their water consumption. Okay, so I'll be more specific about that in just a few minutes. A second, and this is going to be the major focus of Keith's talk today, is water markets. Okay, so if we have water that's being used in some sectors to produce goods and services of higher value than in other sectors, then even if the prices are not correct in the strict economic sense, you could imagine that you could have gains from trade, mutually beneficial trades between, for example, agriculture and cities. And I'll talk only very briefly about that because, as I mentioned, Keith will be giving us a lot of details on that in just a few minutes. And then finally, economists talk a lot about benefit cost analysis, okay? And Ari talked about this somewhat in his presentation as well. And because of the discussion that we just had with Carlos Rubinstein and Liz Fazio, this is becoming increasingly important in the state of Texas. We haven't had for a long time this kind of concerted state investment in water supply insurance, essentially, right? These infrastructure projects. And so if we're looking to an era in which that kind of investment is expanded and we're leveraging taxpayer funds to do that, then thinking very, very carefully about what the benefits and costs of these projects is going to be increasingly important. And that's, I always sort of think about an instructive case right now is the state of California, which for a long time has had massive infrastructure investments on the part of the state, moving water from the relatively wetter north to the relatively drier south. And those infrastructure investments have had lots of associated costs. You could, so of course, there's lots of associated benefits as well. But in an increasingly arid climate, and potentially looking even more so into the future, California this year will make no deliveries to the farms and the cities on the sort of end of the pipe of that project or that series of projects, simply because it's been too dry. And the snowpack in the north is not sufficient to support those kinds of deliveries. So we certainly want to avoid getting into a situation like that here in Texas, right? We're investing today to think about future supply expansion. We want to be extremely cautious and extremely conservative in thinking about those investments. So I'll touch on that toward the end of my talk. Okay, so how do we think about the water pricing issue? Well, in most markets for goods and services, anything you'd go and buy at the grocery store or when you're going and buying a house, right? Almost anything sort of transaction that happens in your life is happening in a market in which prices are going to signal both the scarcity of a resource and its value in use, right? How much value you're going to produce with it. But for lots of reasons, some of them good, and Ari mentioned some of those reasons, third-party impacts, environmental flows, and so on, for lots of reasons, some good, some bad. Most water is not traded in markets. And when I say bad, I don't mean necessarily bad in a sort of moral sense or an ethical sense, but in an economic sense. Some of those reasons that we don't have more injection of pricing mechanisms into exchange of water in markets for goods and services are not economically justifiable. Okay, so to me that's bad, right? That's my training. But certainly there are certainly good economic reasons for that as well. Interestingly, a lot of water is managed either by the public sector or through public-private enterprises and so on. And so water managers could, in theory, set prices so that all those opportunity costs are recovered and all those benefits and costs of exchange are included, right? Scarcity, value, and use. And real market prices would do this, but right, water pricing, as many of us know, serves many, many goals. Thinking about scarcity, thinking about value and use are just two of many, many things that people are trying to achieve when they set water prices. So we don't often see that. And as Ari mentioned, on the whole, if you look across Texas, but certainly other places as well, what we see is water that is priced beneath what an economist would estimate as value and use. And certainly during scarce periods, right, when we have reservoirs that are at the sort of levels that we saw with the pictures of Elephant Butte, those prices that are not usually changing dynamically to reflect that increased scarcity are probably going to be well below what we would think of as the correct economic price. Okay. So what do? We do lots of other things. If we're not pricing water to reflect scarcity, how do we manage scarcity? Well, lots and lots of programs out there. So I just sort of threw in some pictures from various places. The sort of upper left panels are from the city of El Paso's water utility, right? They have a watering schedule. You've got watering restrictions, essentially it's kind of rationing current supplies across different users. You have lots of rebate and incentive programs. The picture in the middle is from a city of El Paso as well. And that's right, distributing free low-flow shower heads and small fixtures. The far right, the picture on the top is the city of Austin. Again, watering restrictions, rationing of some kind. That takes place in residential, commercial, and public sector settings as well. On the bottom, you have the city of San Antonio, which is invested also very heavily in water conservation. You have these kind of appliance retrofit programs, various incentives, rebate programs, and so on. And then lots of education as well. The picture of that guy down in the bottom left-hand corner is from the city of Dallas, right, which does lots of education and information provision regarding, right, how much water does a lawn really require in certain weather conditions and so on. So we do lots of these things, and I would say on the whole, there's lots and lots of work now in economics and in other fields as well on the effectiveness of these programs. I'd say on the whole, the research would suggest that they can be effective in certain times in certain places. You have to worry about things like rebound effects if you're sort of reducing essentially the cost of running an appliance by making it more water efficient. People might actually use it more often. So that's been shown, for example, for front-loading clothes washers and other appliances as well. And then also you have to think about whether some of these subsidy programs are really incentivizing new retrofits or whether they're kind of just causing people maybe to retrofit a little bit early, something they would have done anyway. Okay, so thinking about assessing that, the efficiency of that public investment is very important, and we could use a lot more work in that regard. And on the whole, I would say these kinds of programs are important complements to charging the right price. They're not substitutes for necessarily charging the right price. And water demand does respond to price changes. One of the things that you often hear when you start talking to folks who don't have a lot of background in economics is that, you have to really, really increase the price a lot in order to get a significant decrease in demand. And in fact, in some cases that's true. It depends on how low the prices are, or how high the prices are, how valuable the resource is, and so on. But in general, in the residential sector and in the industrial sector in the United States, we see elasticities, or the sort of responsiveness of water demand to a change in price, about on par with what we see for electricity demand. So, and you don't usually hear that claim when people are talking about electricity. People don't say, well, people don't reduce demand when you raise the price. They do, and they do so for water as well. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of published studies since the 1960s showing that, in fact, that's the case. So these are just some numbers in sort of industry. Of course, there's a lot of variation. It depends on what industry you're talking about, whether you're talking about energy generation or chemical manufacturing, and so on. But if you increase the price of water by about 10%, you're going to reduce demand in the short run in industrial settings by 1 to 8%. It's not that far off of residential numbers. There are similar numbers out there for agriculture as well. And the important thing here is that prices achieve that conservation cost effectively. There's several reasons for that. One is that when you raise the price, rather than rationing water or implementing education programs or implementing rebate programs that are targeting a particular water use, like flushing the toilet or washing your clothes, right, or watering a lawn, then the price increase is providing that signal to every user that causes households, firms, farms, right, all of these end users to decide how to reduce consumption in whatever the best way or cheapest way possible might be, and by how much. Okay, so they're deciding how and by how much to respond to that price incentive. And of course, households and firms that have different costs and different benefits of water use can react differently, and it's that flexibility that makes that price instrument more cost effective than some of the other types of approaches that you might see out there. And then, of course, what happens is that after all of these individual end users make their own kind of decisions about how to respond to the price incentive, is that those water use reductions are going to occur among the end users with the lowest kind of value and use for water. And so that's that cost effectiveness advantage. But one thing I would want to say about this as well before thinking a little more carefully about what happens across sectors when you have different prices is that we see often water utilities get into a situation where they achieve water demand reductions using something other than prices, so an education program or a water rationing policy, watering lawns a few days a week and so on. And then after that, right, once their revenues have gone down because there's less water being used and their costs have gone up because they've had to implement a program, they end up in a situation where they have this kind of boomerang price increase that has to happen later on because they simply can't manage with the reduced revenues and the increased costs associated with those policies. And with the range of price elasticity estimates we see for water in Texas and other places in the US right now, water demand is inelastic, meaning if you raise the price by 1%, you decrease demand by less than 1%. So you raise the price and you actually increase utility revenues. Now that provides an interesting policy problem because, you know, often these utilities are rate regulated, they're rate of return regulated, so you have to think about, well, what happens to that sort of increase in revenues in the short run and in the medium run if you have an increase in price. But you don't have that, okay, right, here's something I'm going to ask you to do is to conserve water, and later on I'm going to come and increase your price no matter what you've done in the meantime, right? So that's one of those interesting differences between the two approaches that it's useful to remember. Okay, so last week was the exams. I'm not teaching anymore, so y'all are now, I get to actually talk about a simple economics graph very, very briefly, fulfilling that need for me this week that my students can no longer fill. So basically what I'm going to talk about here is just why we have this situation where we have very, very different values for the water that's in use in different sectors, in Texas and many other places in the country and indeed the world. So what I'm showing here is just a limited water supply. Okay, to imagine the water supply is represented here by this horizontal axis, and you just say you've got two classes of users, municipal users who are represented by this blue demand curve here, and agricultural users represented here with the green. And imagine that we're going to split up this entire limited supply just between these two sectors. Okay, so we're going to go, you could imagine giving cities anything from nothing, right, all the way to the full supply at this end, or giving farms nothing all the way to the complete supply at this end, so they're kind of moving positively in opposite directions. But what you really want to do, or we're really going to do, is probably split it up somehow. Now, if you had a market, okay, for this water, what would end up happening, right, is these guys would trade until the value and use of that water was approximately equal. Okay, lots of lumps in this and might not come out perfectly, certainly not in the short run, but eventually you'd kind of tend toward this equilibrium, and this would be approximately your market, you know, what I'll call your market clearing price. Okay, if you charge that price, you're going to equate those values in use on the margin. But in fact, what we usually have is some different distribution, and I'm drawing it over here because it's generally representative of the case in Texas and in other parts of the country, especially in the West, that you have some allocation, right? And what this is doing is saying, okay, I'm going to take municipal users and they're going to have less than what the market would provide given their willingness to pay. And agricultural users are going to get more than what the market would provide. And so you get this big gap, right, between the values essentially on the margin that the water is being used for in these different sectors. Okay, and that can happen either because of a quantity constraint like this, just literally saying either the current water right structures implies this allocation, right, or we're going to cut you back in a case of a drought in terms of quantity, or because of these differences in prices, right? Either way, and in Texas we certainly have a combination of both, right? Municipal users on the whole have these higher amounts that they pay per acre foot than agricultural users, right? So those different prices and those different quantity allocations basically drive this huge gap in the value of water that's used in different sectors that you would have seen in the tables that Ari showed just a little bit earlier. And we're not alone in this, Okay, so in some sense that makes us feel good or that makes us feel bad. As an economist, it makes us a little bit worried. But in general, like most countries, if these are just showing from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development some statistics from 2001, so it's going back a little ways, but it's still representative of today's situation. The darkest bar is agriculture, the lightest bar is industry, and then the middle blue is households. And this is just a comparison of water prices across those three sectors in the 1990s. And what you can see is, especially in dry countries like Greece, Spain, United States has significant arid regions as well, Hungary, Australia, Portugal, Turkey. These are pretty dry places, and what you can see is those agricultural prices are just a tiny, tiny fraction of what water users are paying in other sectors. So this is a very common situation that we see as economists. So what happens when you have those big differences? Well, even when you don't have a formal market, right, and Keith is going to be talking about markets, even when you don't have a formal market, those potential gains from trade, right, or some less appealing to an economist allocation mechanism, like I'm going to, fight, right, to get more water out of agriculture, or I'm going to fight to get more water from cities, right, are obvious to each of these parties, right? They become very obvious, and so this political pressure to reallocate is particularly strong, and it's particularly strong when water supplies are very scarce, right? We get those conversations that happen during the summer and during particularly dry years that we might not see in other years. Do water markets work? Well, Keith is going to talk about that. All I'm going to show you is that a trend in the United States between 1987 and 2005, there's been a fair amount of research on this lately. This is just looking at the total number of transfers over these periods, climbing, climbing, climbing. And what are the big kind of contributors to those transfers? It's this little light time series here in the second one here from the top, which are agriculture to urban transfers. Right? This is just to say that when you kind of open the faucet and you let the market work, you do see this reallocation from the lower valued uses to the higher valued uses. And finally, right, so that was water pricing, water markets, benefit cost analysis, the final contribution, right, I think in terms of basic concepts. Again, this is extremely important in Texas right now at the sort of advent of thinking about funding new projects. And I would say that if the sort of economic history of large water projects tends to show that these very large water projects have benefits that do not tend to exceed their costs. Okay? When you think holistically about benefits and costs, but meaning that they're basically going to be subsidizing water use in one location or by one sector or by one set of users at the greater expense of the rest of us. Okay? And that's very common. We make decisions like that all the time about redistributing, right, benefits and costs, and so it's not uncommon even outside of the water sector. But that said, my perspective on this is that the new programs should try to avoid this kind of pitfall of western and southwestern water projects, right, and not look back as they are very sort of carefully in California today, thinking, well, what went wrong, right? How did we invest in this project that can no longer deliver the services that it really promised to deliver over time, and at the same time has damaged, in many cases, the kind of natural capital assets that were really, the program was desired, or the investments were designed to maximize. And so the guidance here would be try to identify these sort of best projects using rigorous benefit cost analysis, and certainly to count reduced in-stream flows and or reduced groundwater levels on the cost side of the ledger when you're looking at those projects. So concluding thoughts, pricing water at its full opportunity cost signals its scarcity. The market doesn't do that because we're not exchanging water in a market, right? But prices could still do that if they were set appropriately. There are lots of other pieces of the puzzle that are complements to, but not substitutes for charging those right prices. And even with those big price differences and value differences across sectors, if you allow the water to flow between sectors and people to make those mutually beneficial trades, you can still end up in the right place, which is good news. And then finally, in terms of benefit cost analysis, that those folks who have their fingers on the purse strings, right, for new projects, new infrastructure projects in particular, should think like the market would, right? Be very conservative in thinking about funding judicious investments in new projects, analyze the benefits and the costs, and count that depreciation of natural capital when you do that. Thank you.
Good morning. So before I start, you might wonder why an economist from the Federal Reserve is here. I will not be talking about monetary policy. The Federal Reserve was set up as back in 1914 as a regional institution so that monetary policy wouldn't be dictated by people in Washington, D.C., There are 12 Federal Reserve banks across the country that report conditions in their district at the FOMC, so this policy institution can have a broader kind of base analysis of what's happening in the economy. As a part of that, the banks have regional economists that look at growth in the different districts across the country. The 11th Federal Reserve District of the Dallas Fed is mostly Texas. It has some parts of New Mexico and Louisiana. And as a regional economist, as I look forward and look at growth in Texas, obviously water is an important issue, and hence why I'm here. The presentation that I have here was developed for our board of directors who are not water experts, and tried to pull together a lot of the research done by people that are here today to give a kind of summary or overview of water conditions and how markets can affect water allocation in the state. So a lot of the slides that I have, if every speaker wants to have some value added, and mine probably should be to go very fast to try to get us on schedule. Since much of the stuff that I have in this presentation is pretty broad that you may already know or has already been covered or will be covered. But anyway, I'll go through it, and I have to say Sheila did an excellent job talking about the basic concepts of economics applied to water. So, you know, I think a lot of people, if they read the newspaper about water, they see that you know, we have a lot of population growth. Texas has been very successful economically and draws in a lot of people to the state, so population is growing fast, and we see more and more shortages of water, and so they see a very kind of bleak picture in water. But if you're an urban user, you often look at your water bill and you see how cheap water is. There was a price consumption in Dallas mentioned. How cheap water is compared to your other utilities, and you think, is there really a shortage at all? If water is so scarce, how come it is so cheap? So in this is kind of the outline, just as a summary that we gave to our board of the major issues that we see in water. Obviously, we talked about the drought, and it's important to know that you know, East Texas is doing pretty well. As you go south and west, things get worse. And that's the same thing with water level capacities in terms of reservoirs. Groundwater has also seen declines. The Trinity Aquifer obviously has fallen very sharply. Ogallala, which is the big source of groundwater in the state, is down by hundreds of feet. So this is from the Water Development Board, which you already saw. I can go through that pretty fast. So here's the chart of who uses water in the state, and you have agricultural irrigation using 61% and municipal use at 27%. To me, this is a very optimistic slide, with markets allowing the potential for sales of water where both farmers and municipalities can be better off. And then you can see that irrigation is, groundwater is mostly concentrated in irrigation use, and surface waters split more evenly. So when we start getting into the economics, as you heard in the previous two presentations, that water is not, water allocation and price are not based on supply and demand. Obviously, the history of water in Texas and throughout the West is that water is kind of a free good, and it's just basically how you allocate the rights to the water. And so most of this stuff you already know. Surface water rights are issued by the state. You know, consumers don't have water rights. Most consumers, urban consumers, they buy it from public entities, which mostly are by legal requirement or other requirement or sell water based on cost of delivery and treatment. So groundwater historically is based on the rule of capture, which is open access. but conservation districts are becoming more and more powerful in terms of allocating property rights to groundwater. Let me see. So prices are a very powerful thing. We often take it for granted. We often want the lowest price we can get, and kind of behind the long-term these water plans is the idea to allow to prepare for enough water at a low price, and so prices can be very important in terms of allocating a scarce resource, as the previous presenter mentioned. You know, one of the things that the drought has done, it drove up several years back the cost of feed, which caused a lot of cattle producers to bring cattle to market. So we know that right now we have a smaller amounts of cattle, and thus the future production of meat is going to decrease. And yet when you look at projections of the beef industry, they rarely talk about shortages. What are the shortages of beef? They talk about what the price, they predict the price of beef in the future. And when you predict the price of beef, consumers can make decisions, and they can substitute other goods, and businesses and restaurants can plan for higher prices. It's a lot harder to plan for shortages. And so price is really a key element that should reflect supply and demand, as really eloquently shown in the previous presentation. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Surface water allocation, I don't know. I don't even know if I need to go through this. Most of you know all this stuff, right? Water rights are allocated in a first in time, first and right. Most basins in the state are fully allocated. The legal framework allows for water transfers and water markets in terms of surface water, but as we know, there are many restrictions, and there are some active water markets in the state. The challenges for markets in surface water include the no injury rule for water transfers. Interbasin transfers are hampered by the junior rights rule, which was brought up earlier, meaning that was I think in 1997, where if you water transferred interbasin, it becomes a junior right. 70% of water rights are held by public entities and water authorities. I think that makes, for planning, is a good thing, but really markets work best when you have lots of buyers and sellers. And so as we move forward, even if this obviously domination of the sellers is likely to continue, within these markets, say the Lower Colorado River Authority, they have some 3,000 customers, to think about ways that, at least in times of scarcity, market principles can be used in terms of allowing customers along the river to benefit from sales to each other. So market principles, even if we don't have true markets or true free markets in water, within entities we can think of ways that market principles can more efficiently allocate water. Groundwater is a different problem. Obviously the rule of capture is very inefficient. You know, I was involved in a water conference when I moved to San Antonio within the Fed. In the 90s, we had a water conference there, and one of the what was I going to talk about? I lost my train of thought. But let me see. Okay. Yeah, the rule of capture. So obviously, oh, okay, now I know what I was going to talk about. After we did that conference, I was invited to give a speech in West Texas, and it's pretty challenging to go to West Texas and talk about water, especially when you're not an expert on the subject. But anyway, I did, and I talked about private property rights, and I was talking about how important it is to have private property rights to a certain amount of water, to a fixed amount, or else you really don't have water. It's property rights. There's a tragedy of the commons is a common term in economics. But anyway, after the speech, I was called a communist, which is was I thought was interesting. But now they're looking more seriously after the T. Boone Pickens thing about having private property rights to groundwater. But anyway, these groundwater conservation districts are trying to establish this, and it's been supported by the state Supreme Court, but it's still on shaky legal ground. As long as the rule of capture is around, it's very hard to legally allocate private property rights. Okay, so the challenge is when you don't have legal rights to a fixed amount of water, it means that the seller doesn't have, can't guarantee a fixed amount of water. And that makes the difficulty as a challenge for water markets. Also, these groundwater conservation districts, while helping in terms of establishing private property rights to groundwater, have also become very territorial and imposed export limits and fees on water exports. 3 minutes. I wasn't going as fast as I thought. Okay, so some of the ways that has been brought up by other researchers and that I think are good ideas is to better define injury in surface water, to reduce legal battles, eliminate junior water rights rule on interbasin transfers, encourage water authorities to reduce take-or-pay contracts and allow resales within the users along the basin. In terms of groundwater, strengthen the role of these groundwater conservation districts to assign private property rights and to minimize export restrictions. And in general, just to increase private property rights so that markets can take place. So I talked a lot about prices, and prices were mentioned in the previous chart. These are some municipal water prices and how Texas cities with the stars here compare to other cities in the survey from across the country. And basic water, obviously, you know, agua es vida, as we say in San Antonio, water's life. And it's important for households to have a base amount of water for a low price. But after that, water should be priced and more priced in terms of what the market can bear. And you can see that while San Antonio supposedly has a fairly significant water shortage, it's not very reflected in the price. You can see Santa Fe on the right is a very steep price for high users. And more cities may move to that. But if water is actually, if markets increase and water is moved more freely amongst users, that steep price may actually not be, maybe too high and would be able to come down. So I wanted to finish with reasons to be optimistic. When I entered into this kind of looking at this issue, it seemed very dreaded. It seemed like that we're in deep doo-doo, and that Texas is going to have that economic growth would be hampered significantly from water shortages. I don't believe that. I think as scarcity increases, agencies and water entities are seeing the usefulness of water markets and how we can use water markets to more efficiently allocate water. There's an overused quote that supposedly comes from Mark Twain, although it's never been proven, that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And that, you know, if you think about that, whiskey is provided in free markets, and there's usually not a shortage. Even in Austin, after the last couple football years, there's still a lot of whiskey around. But water comes from a very different economic process, and we need to continue to think about how that's allocated and what markets can provide for water allocation. And I think we are, and we're moving in that direction. And I think as scarcity increases, we'll be more and more innovative about allowing markets to allocate our water. And that's all I have.
Yes, Mr. Phillips, I'd like to ask you and the others to comment a bit about one of the points you just made. There's an increasing number of private entities in the state securing water rights from across the state and preparing to market that water primarily to urban areas. Have you, at this time, done any measuring of how much you think of that is going on? There seems to be more of those groups every day.
Water markets are often not publicly reported. So we have, across the West, very poor data, except for the ones that are willing to say how much they paid. And, the prices, it's like real estate. It's location, location, location. And many of the transactions in Texas, and particularly in the Lower Valley, are leases. So they're an annual lease from agriculture to urban areas. And Keith mentioned first in time, first in right. That's only true in parts of Texas. For example, the Rio Grande River, all the way down from El Paso to the Gulf, municipal rights come number one. So if there's a shortage, it's agriculture. And it's not based on the price of that. It's typically, the transactions occur at the cost of service, and rarely much above that. That's a long answer, but.
Yeah, and let me just say that, you know, water, these, I think most people fear most about markets is, say, wealthy individuals buying up water rights and holding monopoly power for certain basins. You know, there are wealthy individuals getting involved in this, Red McCombs for one. So we need to have the rules in place, antitrust provisions and other things to make sure that that would never happen. But once again, we need to know the very basic principles of what makes for healthy markets is lots of buyers and sellers.
I'm Bob Drought, West Texas A&M University. First a comment and then second a question and comment. First comment is with the establishment of the Edwards Aquifer Authority in 1993, I think we saw a really good case study of water markets as the Edwards Aquifer Authority implemented their rules with the 2 acre-feet per acre per year. We found that agricultural interests in some cases were able to sell the 1 acre-foot that was severable. We saw other agricultural interests that decided to multi-crop as a result of that. And so there was, I would say, a case study in that.
Mm-hmm.
The recent Supreme Court rulings and last legislative session, I think it's a little bit too early to start drawing any conclusions about how those are going to play out on that. The other one is I've seen throughout the day, not just this last panel, but throughout the day, kind of a positioning of agriculture versus municipal. And I'm questioning the validity of that. And I'm questioning the validity of that based upon the idea that agriculture doesn't derive a benefit from municipal use or industrial use. But municipal use derives a benefit from agricultural use. So would anybody like, and that's open to the panel for comment, whoever.
So first, I'll say a little bit less about the first question and try maybe on the second question. On the first question, I think you're right. That's an interesting and important case study. I think the fact that it was precipitated by, you know, sort of a crisis is instructive. and that, wonder whether, right, that might be what's necessary regionally, right, in some ways, unfortunately, to really think about restructuring things so that water can flow to the higher valued uses. And I'm sensitive to the second question too, right? You're right that, crops have got to be grown somewhere. And if you look at the maps in the first presentation this morning, it looks like a lot of the West is going to get drier, and this is where a lot of our agricultural production is. And so, my standard response to that is that, agricultural markets are international markets largely, when you look at, a willingness to pay for energy development, for example, of, $115,000 per acre foot, even the city uses pale in comparison, right, to that willingness to pay. So, I don't think the message from economics is that, oh, well, we just shouldn't have agriculture in these regions anymore, right? I think that we're going to end up, if you sort of look at the the simple graph that I draw, you think about a price if we have markets ending up somewhere in between, right? And that there would be some agriculture and some more energy development and some more urban development. But the point about markets, I think, is really important, because the point is that if you have these reallocation take place over time, because that pressure, right, from those incredibly divergent values becomes so strong that you begin to see political changes, legislative changes, changes in the distribution of rights legally, it's hard to see how agricultural interests benefit from that. Whereas if you look at the marketing case, and we see this happening in other arenas too, fishing and other industries where there has to be some reallocation of rights, markets can provide significant benefits. It's just a matter of, right, having the ability to charge what the value of the water is to the other user. Right, if you have these very high willingnesses to pay, farmers could make out pretty well if you had some increased kind of liquidity, so to speak, in water markets in Texas. So it's not on the whole, right, to say that agriculture is going to disappear. It's not on the whole to say that farmers won't even benefit, right, from essentially selling water rather than selling crops for some portion of their production. But the way that those kinds of systems are structured is absolutely essential to the end outcome, right, for the participants, including farmers.
Well, and I think the discussion about groundwater in particular being a property right and comes into play pretty significantly with that. And even though the argument that a set amount of groundwater under a piece of property would be one property right versus the rule of capture, where you take whatever you can get, and perhaps if your neighbors are not withdrawing theirs, then you're really taking from them. When you consider the Edwards Aquifer and that karst geology, the Edwards can be dry today and full tomorrow. Yep. It happens. The Ogallala, on the other hand, is a non-renewable resource, and what comes out of that is going to come out of it, but the amount of time it takes to really pull from a very long distance away is a pretty long time. So those, I think it's at some level a moot point whether it's a defined quantity of water beneath the property, or if it's just the right to be able to withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have to really cut questions.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to, very quickly, we'll try to go for one or two more questions.
I'm not an expert by any means, but I'd submit for your consideration a couple of large water resource projects, Lake Livingston and Lake Conroe in particular, where a broad audience of municipal, agricultural, and industrial users seem to have fared just fine. I wonder if you could give me some examples of your premise where large water projects seem to benefit the few to the detriment of the many.
Yeah, was that your question? Did you have an additional question?
Pardon?
Was that's the end of your question? Okay. Yes, so again, right, I'm not from Texas, so I'm less familiar with the specific examples that you listed, and I'm sure there are examples in which, right, there are net benefits from water projects on the whole. The classic examples, I would say, are things like the Central Arizona project. The estimates for that project are, a loss in the order of, I think it's $67 billion in net loss. Of course, regionally, it has phenomenal net benefits, right, to the city of Phoenix and other beneficiaries. But when you look at the project as a whole, right, it cost, in that case, it was federal taxpayers, right, so it was a substantial federal subsidy, a lot more than the benefits it delivered to those users. And so my point was that in an era, right, in Texas where all of this $2 billion that's going to be leveraged for additional potential projects comes from state taxpayer funds, right, that we ought to ensure, right, that on the whole at the state level, the benefits of those things are positive rather than negative in some of those kind of classic cases that we see in the West.
Well, I guess the conclusion to be drawn from contrasting central Arizona with Texas reservoir projects that, as usual, one rule doesn't fit all.
That's
you
true.
have to consider the specifics in making public interest and cost benefit and not apply some broad-based rule from another part of the country to Texas.
Absolutely, that's definitely true.
One more question.
Hi, I'm Steve Potter. I'm a hydrologist working on my Ph.D. I'm just kind of curious about the discount rate and how that goes into whether these projects are actually the cost benefit of evaluating different projects and evaluating different projects between the conservation and the water supply. Does that make a difference? Does the discount rate make a difference and that sort of thing?
Yes, it makes a huge difference. And there's a lot of debate among economists about what an appropriate discount rate is for a public project. Some people say it should be the market interest rate. Some people say since it's a public project, it should have a lower discount rate. It makes the biggest difference on large upfront capital cost expenditures. And the present value of those are much greater than if you're looking 30, 40, 50 years out to incurring those costs. And even a small discount rate, 30, 40, 50 years, is going to make those costs look very small.
So how do we figure out which are the appropriate ones? Are economists thinking about that, or are they leaving it to people who are actually proposing the projects to put that into their numbers and into their models so that it's evaluated?
A lot of times it is legislative. It's set. There's also an organization that I'm a member of called the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, and that's a very hot topic of what the appropriate rate is.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks, panelists. I think we should recognize that a couple of representatives took their time out from their day to spend their time here as a reflection of how important this water is. Okay.
I just wanted to point out that we have a couple of individuals that are elected representatives that chose to be with us today as a reflection of the importance of this issue, and I think we should recognize that, in fact, they were able to do that. George Lavender is here from District 1, and Representative Doug Miller from New Braunfels. And again, thank you for attending. We hope that we have I think pulling this group of people together is exactly what we're trying to do, and thank you again for attending. We're going to take a short break of 10 minutes. We're going to restart at 5 till 11.